Hey guys, this is George and I'm back with a new video. So San Diego Comic-Con, it's came and gone, and now we have the Disney Expo, which is already giving us a ton of information. I've actually had to change up this video because new information came out, so I added in some new stuff and took out a few other things because so many things are happening in the MCU and it looks like there's a lot of things on the horizon. But something I did want to talk about, something I keep coming back to in my head, is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I think fans were already supercharged with excitement once we knew Doctor Strange was getting his sequel, but I think the title of the film, In the Multiverse of Madness, kind of sent that level of excitement through the roof. I know it did for me. So if you're wondering why so much excitement, well, it really has to do with the word multiverse in the title. If you've been a fan of the comics, you already know about the multiverse and alternate universes and alternate timelines, but for those who aren't that familiar with comics and kind of the inner workings of comics and such, the multiverse has kind of been a huge thing in the MCU for a long time. And after the events of Avengers Endgame, and specifically hearing the word multiverse mentioned in Spider-Man Far From Home, it's definitely something that's on the mind of a lot of fans. So the multiverse, it's out there, and I think we're going to be seeing it revealed a little more and a little more throughout the upcoming Marvel films, and I think this is ultimately going to culminate in something huge in Doctor Strange 2. So in this video, I'll just share my thoughts on the potential heroes, villains, and just characters we might see once Doctor Strange journeys into the Multiverse of Madness. And be warned, there are spoilers in this video, so if you hear something you're not familiar with and you just don't want to hear anything about it, feel free to click off the video and come back later if you want to. And if you're still here, well, let's go ahead and get into this. So one group of characters I think we could see in Doctor Strange 2 is the Dark Avengers. So this one's really easy. Think Avengers, but bad. This group debuted in the comics after the events of Secret Invasion, and basically Secret Invasion is when the Skrulls, who in the comics are an evil group of characters, in the movies they're kind of good guys, but in the comics they're usually bad guys. So the Skrulls, these shape-shifting aliens, infiltrated and nearly conquered the planet through subterfuge. So Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, he actually manages to turn this into a huge PR moment, and he manages to spin this catastrophe into probably his greatest and most successful moment of all time in the comics. And he does this when he kills the Queen of the Skrulls and actually appears to change the outcome of the battle in favor of humanity. And this is all caught on camera, which essentially looks like Norman Osborn's the hero. So because the general public thinks Norman Osborn's a hero, he actually gets a lot of really good things going for him, and this actually culminates in him getting a lot of power. I think he actually becomes like the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And so the heroes, knowing that Osborn's obviously a bad guy, they don't want to work with him at all. And so they decide to kind of go underground. But what Osborn does, which makes for a really interesting story, is that he decides to appoint his own version of the heroes using bad guys, aka the Dark Avengers and the Dark XMen. And it's just a really interesting story, and I think if you can, you definitely want to check it out in the comics, because if this is on the big screen, it's going to be very different from what's in the comics. And the notable inclusions on the Dark Avengers team is actually Norman Osborn. He becomes the Iron Patriot. Daken is actually the son of Wolverine. He actually ends up replacing Wolverine as Dark Wolverine. Bullseye actually becomes Hawkeye. Moonstone actually becomes Miss Marvel. And Matt Gargan, who's actually the Scorpion, but at this time he was bonded with the symbiote, actually becomes the Dark Spider-Man, or Black Costume Spider-Man. And then there's the Sentry. And I haven't even got into the Sentry yet, but he is incredibly powerful and he's actually a hero. There's a lot to the Sentry. He deserves his own video. If you want to see that, let me know. And so normally he's with the Avengers, but him and Norman Osborn have actually become friends, and the Sentry confides in Osborn. And Osborn, being the evil guy that he is, he's just really good at manipulating the Sentry and actually talks him into staying on this team and joining the Dark Avengers. So in the comic, this was a huge moment for the villains of the Marvel Universe, and it'd be interesting to see who would make this team if they brought the Dark Avengers to What If, or if they brought them into the Multiverse of Madness. So who do you think would make the team in the MCU? Most of the villains in the MCU are dead, so I don't think we'd have many to choose from. I mean, maybe Batroc, the Leaper. I also think something that would be really interesting to see is if Kevin Feige decides that this is going to be the path that they use to introduce the Sentry into the MCU as one of the members of the Dark Avengers, and I think that would be really interesting. Like I mentioned, the Sentry is incredibly powerful, so I want to know what you guys think. Fans of the Sentry, do you think this would be pretty cool to see? Or do you just want the Sentry nowhere near the MCU because you know how incredibly powerful he is? Another entry on my list is Peggy Carter as Captain America. So a character that has been confirmed for Disney Plus's What If series is Peggy Carter Captain America. I think she might go by something different, but the story is what if Peggy Carter ended up taking the super soldier serum, so she'll be like a version of Captain America. But the What If series basically answers the questions, what if something happened in the MCU? So an easy way to answer this would be like, what if Iron Man survived Avengers Endgame? And that might actually be something we see in the Multiverse of Madness or a What If story. But in this one, it would be like, what if Peggy Carter had been Captain America? And so Haley Atwell, the actress who plays Peggy Carter, is signed on to reprise her role in the What If series, which is an animated series. But what I think could be interesting is if Atwell is actually in talks to take on the role in a live action film. And if so, well, where do you all think she'd appear? I think my money would be on Doctor Strange 2 and the Multiverse of Madness. I think if the Multiverse of Madness is a multiverse version of an Avengers film like Captain America Civil War was, well, it would be pretty awesome if they decided to bring her on for that. And so I think it would be really interesting, and it is a possibility that we could see her in the Multiverse of Madness. So for the next entry, I was thinking about Doctor Strange as a character. And he's someone, most of his stories, a lot of his stories in fact, are kind of like horror stories. He actually deals with a lot of the dark side of the Marvel Universe in the comics. And so if Doctor Strange 2 is going to explore the multiverse, well, it's probably going to tread on the dark side too. And I think it's probably safe to say that Doctor Strange could visit one of these darker corners of the MCU. And one of Marvel's darkest realities is one in which the world is overrun with vampires. And no, I'm not talking about the Twilight kind of vampires, even though they are actually pretty powerful. I'm leaning more towards the 30 Days of Night can barely control themselves kind of vampires. So if you've read the Paradise X comic book miniseries, there's a band of multiversal heroes who travel to this specific world in order to try to warn the heroes of that reality of an impending doom. But they discover they're far too late, and the world has actually already fallen to the vampire plague. One of the reasons I think this could be a top contender for Doctor Strange 2 is that we recently got the news that Mahershala Ali was cast as Blade. So how cool would it be if Blade were introduced as the last Avenger in a world overrun by vampires? I think that would actually be pretty awesome. And that would actually be a pretty quick way to introduce the character into the MCU. But what do you think? I would actually love to see this in Doctor Strange 2. My only question is, how far would they take the vampires? In the comic, these vampires are highly aggressive. Like I mentioned, 30 Days of Night vampires. And they really are just barely able to control themselves and their bloodlust. So I'm not sure how far the MCU would take this. And on a fun side note, if you're getting into comics, or if you like horror comics and you want a suggestion, well, you should definitely track down the What If issues where Wolverine became king of the vampires. Those are some of my favorite comics, and they're very dark, and I think if you're a horror fan, you could really get a kick out of these. And the next entry on my list is another fan favorite MCU character. So in the comics, we've seen a lot of different versions of Loki over the years, but in the MCU, we really only have two versions. There's Loki, the once villain and forever trickster, who eventually becomes a hero. And then there's the other version of Loki, the one we saw in Avengers Endgame, who's basically back to the evil version of Loki. So Kevin Feige, he actually confirmed that the Disney Plus series will actually follow the evil version of Loki who escaped in Avengers Endgame. But I think it would be pretty cool if in Doctor Strange's excellent adventure through the multiverse, he actually crosses paths with this version of Loki, but also another version of Loki. And that version I'm speaking of is Hero Loki, or the version of Thor Loki that's actually worthy of wielding Mjolnir. I actually think this could be pretty awesome and hilarious, and lead to some very funny and very cool moments in the series. And I think it could either push evil Loki back onto the path of being a hero, like the version of him that died in Avengers Infinity War, or it could possibly send him even further to the dark side, and we could get a really evil version of Loki. So that's a really interesting possibility for Loki that we could see in Doctor Strange 2. But what do you think? Another character on my list who I think might have passed under everyone's radar, but could be pretty awesome if introduced in Doctor Strange 2. And if you thought I was talking about Gwenpool or MODOK, well, good guess, but no, I'm not talking about them, even though MODOK would be pretty cool. I was actually thinking about Throg, the Frog of Thunder. Yeah, you heard right, Frog Thor. In the comics, there's actually two main versions of this character. One is the original Thor Odin's son, who actually gets transformed by none other than Loki. I mean, who else would play like a practical joke like that? Of course it's Loki. And he turns him into a frog. And the second version of the character, who I think we are more likely to see, is actually Simon Walterson. And he was actually mystically transformed into a frog. And after he obtains a shard of Thor's hammer, and he actually proves himself worthy, well, he becomes Throg, the Frog of Thunder. So I love both versions of Throg, and I would love to see them join the MCU. I know they're fan favorites also. So I'd be happy to see either one of the characters. I think Chris Hemsworth's Thor Odin's son would be hilarious, but I'd also like to see Simon Walterson too. But something that I think would be even more cool is that if we don't just get Frog Thor, but we also get the Pet Avengers. I mean, I don't think they would be that far behind, and I'm a huge fan of the Pet Avengers, so I'm hoping we see Frog Thor in the Multiverse of Madness, joined by the Pet Avengers, and that would be incredible for me because I love those characters so much, especially Lockjaw, and he actually exists in the MCU already from the Inhuman series, but I don't know if they bring him or just create another version of Lockjaw. And my next entry is another potential contender for us to see in Doctor Strange 2, and they're actually characters who are already supposed to be in the MCU. So if you guess what I'm talking about, I am talking about the Netflix MCU characters. You know, those characters: Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, the Punisher. There was a lot of hype for those series when they were first announced, especially when we were told that they were supposed to be tied to the MCU proper. And for a time, it actually seemed like they were kind of tied to the MCU, but later we found out that they were on the fringes of the MCU at best, and eventually I think once Netflix cut ties with the MCU, I think they're just cut out completely. But even though their series on Netflix are dead, well, in the multiverse, they're actually out there somewhere. And they actually could potentially cross paths with the MCU proper. And the reason I say this is because I think there's kind of like a cooling off period to where for a certain number of years, Disney can't use the characters and any of their stuff. Well, Doctor Strange 2 is a few years into the future. And so once that comes to pass, well, who knows? They could actually bring everybody back if that time has passed. And if there aren't any other stipulations preventing them from coming back. So it would be possible for Doctor Strange to visit the Netflix MCU, even though I don't think it would be called that. I think we would just know that. But what do you think? If he did go there, well, what character would you like to see most? I think my money would be on Daredevil because I liked him so much. But I really like the Punisher too, so it could be Daredevil or the Punisher. And I feel the next entry on my list is one a lot of Spider-Man fans really want to see, and that would be Spider-Man entering the Spider-Verse and the Venomverse. So I actually wrote this specific entry before the news broke about Sony and Disney failing to renew their deal. So this is actually a revision of that first entry. And I think Spider-Man actually deserves another video after everything that's happened and everything that's still happening with the character. But I did want to keep this entry on this list. So if Marvel, Disney, and Sony somehow work this out, well, there's a strong chance that their agreement would include Tom Holland taking on more of a role in Sony's Spider-Verse and their Venomverse. So even though the multiverse was mentioned just for show in Spider-Man Far From Home, we would actually soon learn with the announcement of Doctor Strange 2 in the Multiverse of Madness that the multiverse is a concept that's here to stay and is probably going to open a lot of doors for seeing multiversal heroes in the MCU. So if the deal is worked out in time, it would be interesting to see if Doctor Strange somehow pops into Tom Hardy's Venomverse to establish a link between those two universes, and would open the door for Tom Holland's Spider-Man to join the Sony Spider-Verse as well as the Venomverse and stay in the MCU proper. And for me, the best thing that could come out of this, the thing I'm hoping most for, is that if it somehow builds up to a live action Spider-Verse and we see Tom Holland Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, and Andrew Garfield Spider-Man for a live action Spider-Verse film. I think that would be amazing, and I hope there have at least been some talks or some discussion of making something like this happen, because I think a lot of fans would really love this, because there's so many people who love the Tom Holland, the Andrew Garfield, the Tobey Maguire versions of this character. And of course, since it's Spider-Verse, there would be a lot more other versions of the character. So hopefully Disney and Sony work this out, because it could really be a win-win for the fans and for the studios to get something like this worked out. And I guess if it were to happen in Doctor Strange 2, that they established that link, I think that could work out for everyone, because it would be an easy way to get the MCU version of Spider-Man into the Sony Spider-Verse and the Venomverse. And next on my list is the X-Men, but specifically the ultimate version of the X-Men. Now that the X-Men and the Fantastic Four are owned by Disney and back with Marvel, it's only a matter of time before they join the MCU. So everyone has their own spec videos on how they could join the MCU, and my personal hope for how the X-Men join the MCU is that they were actually there all along, and that it was Professor X using his incredible telepathic powers to kind of shield the X-Men or make people forget that they were there and to forget that they've been there. But another way that could be done is if they were simply in another universe and they somehow crossed into the MCU proper when Doctor Strange transports to their reality. And so I think this is kind of a long shot, but if it were to come to pass, it's one way we could actually get Hugh Jackman to reprise the role of Wolverine. My thinking is that they could have like a Days of Future Past version of him come into the MCU and alert the Avengers of the presence of mutants in order for the X-Men to kind of reveal themselves to the world and to the Avengers, and for them to ultimately team up to avoid like a dark, bleak future, like the Days of Future Past where the world's been conquered by Sentinels. And I gotta say, I really love Hugh Jackman Wolverine, and for me it would be pretty awesome to see him don the claws one more time. But what do you all think, and how do you personally want to see the X-Men introduced into the MCU? And so the next entry on my list is somebody who I think is almost a no-brainer for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. The reason I say this is because if Doctor Strange is going to be traveling into the multiverse, well, there's a good chance he's going to journey to the nexus of all realities, and guess who's the protector of the nexus of all realities? It's ManThing. ManThing is a comic book character, and how he actually came to be is that after trying to reproduce the super soldier serum that created Captain America, the scientist Ted Sallis was actually a victim of a terrorist attack, and so he was facing his impending death, and he decided to inject himself with the untested serum. And so as everything's coming down around him, instead of transforming into a super soldier, well, their facility was actually located in this swampy area. Well, his body somehow became infused with the swamp around him, and he transformed into basically a swamp monster who's in tune with nature and mysticism, and eventually becomes the protector of the nexus of realities, which is directly related to the multiverse. So ManThing has always been one of Marvel's strangest heroes, but with his ties to mysticism, if he were ever going to debut in the MCU, it would honestly make a lot of sense for him to appear in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Plus, there's one more thing that's kind of interesting. One of his main buddies in the comics, and another really oddball hero, is Howard the Duck. And he's actually already shown up in the MCU in Guardians of the Galaxy, and I think he even had the briefest cameo in Avengers Endgame for the final battle. So I think with Howard the Duck already in the MCU, I think there's a pretty good chance we could get ManThing also. And the next entry is one for all the horror fans. This is definitely something you can sink your teeth into. So it's already been hinted at that the Marvel Zombies will debut in the Disney Plus What If series. But if Doctor Strange 2 is more of a horror film, well, I think it'd be pretty cool if Doctor Strange pops into the Marvel Zombies universe. For those new to Marvel horror stories, Marvel Zombies is exactly what you think it is. When one of Marvel's most powerful superheroes is infected with a zombie virus, things quickly fall apart as hero and villain alike join the ranks of the undead. And as a huge horror fan, I'd actually love to see this in Doctor Strange 2, but I'm honestly not sure how they would take it with the PG-13 rating, which I think Doctor Strange 2 will have. But it'd still be really cool to see. And another entry on my list of characters we could see in Doctor Strange 2 in the Multiverse of Madness is essentially Marvel's version of the Justice League. So the characters I'm about to mention actually have a pretty convoluted history in the comics, and in their first appearance they debuted as the Squadron Sinister, and they actually fought the Avengers. So you could think of them more as Marvel's evil version of the Justice League, but eventually they actually do become the more heroic Squadron Supreme. So the characters on the Squadron Supreme are Hyperion, who's basically the equivalent of Superman, Power Princess equals Wonder Woman, Nighthawk equals Batman, Dr. Spectrum is supposed to be like Green Lantern, and the Wizard is, well, the Flash. These are the main team members of the Squadron Supreme. So the reason I think we might actually see them in Doctor Strange 2 is that the Squadron Supreme, I've noticed they've recently had a really big resurgence in the comics, and they've actually played pretty big roles in recent Avengers books. So for me, it really isn't too big of a stretch to think that Marvel might be planting seeds for a possible introduction into the MCU. And honestly, where else would they debut other than a film in the MCU multiverse? The next character who could show up in Doctor Strange 2 is Deadpool. I'm just going to come out and say it. It's Deadpool. This one is honestly just too easy because Deadpool is known for crossing realities and breaking the fourth wall on the regular. So just imagine the wackiest, most impossible way that Deadpool could slip into the MCU, and bam! There you have it. Deadpool's in the MCU. I mean, honestly, Deadpool's just too easy. It would be hilarious if Doctor Strange actually visits the Fox Marvel universe and somehow Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool manages to cross into the MCU proper. I honestly feel like Ryan Reynolds is going to continue as Deadpool, and I think he's going to be the Deadpool of the MCU also. So how do you all think this is going to go down? I mean, how do you want Deadpool to enter the MCU? So for the next entry, I've actually been really intrigued by the resurgence of the next character on my list. The character I'm talking about is Conan the Barbarian. He's actually had a long history in Marvel Comics, but he's actually not a Marvel creation. He was created by the author Robert E. Howard. So after Marvel lost the publishing rights to Dark Horse Comics, he went over there for a while, and now he's back at Marvel. But what I think that's really interesting isn't just that he's back at Marvel and he's leading his own comic book series again. What I think's really interesting is that the House of Ideas decided to thrust Conan into the present day Marvel Comics and put him on the Avengers, specifically the Savage Avengers. So we learned that Blade would be joining the MCU as played by Mahershala Ali. So what I think was really interesting about this is that before this announcement was made, Blade had actually risen in prominence and was making more appearances with the Avengers and the X-Men. And this actually always seemed really odd to me before because I really like Blade a lot, but Blade's mostly a solo character who occasionally served on the team group the Midnight Suns. So when he started showing up a lot more in the Avengers and X-Men books, well, it had me scratching my head quite a bit. But it would actually all make sense if Marvel was building up the character for something more, like joining the MCU. The reason I mention this is because I think maybe the same thing could be happening with Conan the Barbarian. So I tried to do a little research and see who actually has the film rights at this time for Conan, but I couldn't find that info. But I think Disney probably has the rights because I don't think that they would just license the publishing rights and not the film rights. I think if they can get them, they would get both. I just feel like there's more to this than just like, hey, we got Conan back, let's make comics about him. I mean, it could just be that, but I really feel like there's more to it. And I really like Conan a lot, I always have. So I think it would be really interested if they're planting the seeds for something more for Conan. Potentially Conan joining the MCU. So what do you think? Could we be getting swords and sorcery in the MCU in the near future? Would you want to see Conan joining the Avengers? Let me know what you guys think. And the next entry on my list is one that I actually made at the last minute after I heard the news that She-Hulk would be getting her own Disney Plus series. So the next multiverse character I think we could be seeing in Doctor Strange 2 is the Maestro. And the Maestro is basically what happens if Hulk decided to take over the planet. Basically, it's an evil version of the Hulk from the future, but not like the evil Hulk from the Old Man Logan comic book series where he just sits in a cave all day doing evil stuff like some creepy cave troll. No, the Maestro is the evil Hulk with all of Banner's wits and all of Hulk's strength, and he uses them to the fullest ability, and he literally has a castle and a trophy room made up of trophies of the dead superheroes that he killed. So I was listening to a video from Grace Randolph from Beyond the Trailer. It's actually a really great channel. You should check it out. There's a lot of really great information about the movie industry, especially Marvel films. And so I'll leave a link to that video in my description of this video. But Grace actually mentioned something really interesting. And if I'm understanding correctly, I think she mentioned that the reason that Marvel and Kevin Feige probably greenlit She-Hulk, other than She-Hulk being a really cool character, is that they kind of wanted to do a backdoor to get Mark Ruffalo's The Hulk into the Disney Plus series. And so the reason that's even an issue or a thing is that Marvel actually doesn't have the full rights to make like Hulk movies. I think they have to get permission from like Universal. I think Universal actually has those rights. So that's why he only appears in Avengers movies, and he actually hasn't had his own movie for a long time. So I'm not sure if this is actually the case, but I think she was speculating that we could see Mark Ruffalo's The Hulk in She-Hulk. And the reason I mentioned Bruce Banner, Mark Ruffalo's The Hulk, is because the Maestro is usually a Hulk villain, but I think it would be really interesting if the Maestro somehow crossed into the MCU, because he would be a serious threat for not only She-Hulk and the Hulk, and possibly the entire MCU, because he is so powerful. I think it would be incredible, yeah, pun intended, if they introduced the Maestro by having Doctor Strange transported to a trophy room of dead superheroes, and he sees the Eye of Agamotto there, only to be confronted by the Maestro, and the Maestro sees Doctor Strange escape into another reality and somehow follows, and he's transported into the MCU. Do you think the Maestro would be a great Shulky villain, or do you think there's someone else that would be better for Shulky to face off with? Let me know in the comments. And so for the last entry on my list, I thought we would go out with a bang. Earlier, I mentioned Marvel's version of the Justice League, aka the Squadron Supreme, but what about the real deal? And so for the last entry on my list, with nearly a 0% chance of showing up in Doctor Strange 2 and the MCU, is the Justice League. So even though there is no chance we're going to see the Justice League in Doctor Strange 2, in a multiverse of infinite possible universes, we know the Justice League are out there. On one multiversal plane, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the other Leaguers are fighting the good fight. And all we need is a glimpse of the heroes, a silhouette of these three standing side by side for the seeds to be planted for an eventual Avengers JLA film. Sure, this is just a fan dream at best, but stranger things have happened. And if you actually research how difficult the Sony Marvel deal was for SpiderMan, it took a lot of really strange things happening for this to actually happen. So it's not completely out of the range of possibility for us to get an Avengers Justice League crossover. And so I think if they were actually going to plant the seeds for this, it would be very cool to see in Doctor Strange 2. Plus, there is comics precedence for the two comic universes crossing paths, like the incredible Avengers JLA crossover, the numerous individual crossovers like Superman vs. Spider-Man, as well as one enormous company-wide crossover where every company's character cross paths with each other. I mean, who can forget the battle of Lobo and Wolverine? So this actually can happen. The only question is if it will ever happen. And if you're still not convinced, if you even want to see this happen, well, here's this image so you can think about how amazing it would be to see this on the big screen. Just imagine Superman wielding Mjolnir and Captain America's shield on the big screen. Enough said. So that's it for this video. I know it was a lot to take in. Which characters on this list, if any, do you think will appear in the MCU? Are there any characters I missed that you think could appear in Doctor Strange 2? And would you all love to see the Avengers meet the Justice League on the big screen? Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. If so, leave a like, subscribe for more comic book content, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.